Welcome to the 14th episode of the Global Guessing Weekly podcast. Today we are joined with a very special guest, perhaps the most special to date, in Gaia Dempsey, the CEO of Metaculus. If you're watching this podcast on YouTube or you're listening on one of our podcasting platforms, you probably know what Metaculus is and you've probably used it a good amount. But today we're hoping to dig into a bit of the person behind Metaculus, how she got to where she is today and what she sees as the future of Metaculus moving forward. Guy, I want to give you an opportunity to say a couple words about yourself for our listeners, and then hopefully we can also hear your story about how you became the CEO of Metaculus and sort of what you were doing before then.
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor. I do want to just really start by saying that there are many people behind Metaculus, and I'm just one of them. First, starting with the four founders of Metaculus who actually started the project all the way back in 2014. I've been involved since 2019, and I'll tell a little bit of that story. And then, of course, in addition to the founders and the team, the forecasters and the hundreds and thousands of people who participate from all around the world. So it's definitely a community project. I can share a little bit about sort of how I arrived here and got to be a part of this team. So my background is in mostly sort of tech entrepreneurship. I shortly after graduating from college, got involved and co-founded a tech company that made augmented reality products, hardware and software. And I did that for 7 years and helped to grow that company in a fairly sort of classic, fast growth mode, really incredible startup journey. And I just learned a ton and had a blast and got to work with some really brilliant people. Mostly the clients that we were working with were enterprise companies at the time. Especially toward the end, we did actually do some work with government contracts through government grants. And so I got to dip my toe a little bit in the water of doing research projects, and just thought that was very exciting. And so when I decided to sort of step away from that after a 7-year stint there, I was exploring, just getting reconnected with some of my intellectual and academic interests and curiosity there, and ended up starting to get very excited about just the impact of artificial intelligence on society and sort of the ethical dimensions. And in my time working in AR, we thought a lot about the augmentation of people and our, and human capabilities using technology. And so there was a pretty strong connection there. And sort of through my exploration of just the AI world, I ended up meeting Anthony Aguirre, who's one of the founders of Metaculus. And when we first met, we were not really talking about forecasting at all. We were talking about AI, and we were talking about we were talking about the future, but we were talking about it more in the realm of sort of scenario planning and simulation, and looking at possible futures and how truly transformative technologies could create sort of very different future worlds, and sort of what the impacts of that could be. And we ended up organizing a conference together to bring people from different disciplines to really kind of have that space to do that scenario planning and to do some world building and sort of wargaming and simulation scenarios, which was a great time. And then eventually we ended up co-authoring a paper on AI ethics with 2 other co-authors. And so it was just this collaboration that started to expand and flourish. And somewhere along the way, he said, hey, I also have this project called Metaculus, and you have an entrepreneurial background, and would you be interested in advising? And so I started to kind of make forecasts and get to know the community and the tools. Um, and about a year after I began advising, we all decided that I would come on full time as CEO. And so that was almost a year ago now.
And what sort of drew you in particular to the forecasting side of things, and Metaculus in particular? Like, is there a common thread between forecasting and what was being done at Takari with AI that you sort of found a similar passion, or was it something that was different enough, but still in the same sort of human augmentation that really brought you interested into this topic?
It's a great question. I think that for me, the thread that I see that is a really strong connection is about sort of the way that we improve our decision-making processes as people and as organizations. So in augmented reality, a lot of what we were doing at Daiquiri was helping people to visualize data in a decision relevant space in real time. And that those tools were appropriate for a lot of kinds of like manufacturing and industrial work where you're connecting things that are happening live on the ground with sort of the bigger picture company strategy. And in forecasting, it's uh, obviously a whole different set of tools. But there is this common theme around improving how we think. One of my lifelong heroes is Douglas Engelbart. And, in his classic treatise, he really talks about if you invest in improving the way that human beings think, that's kind of an infinitely returning investment because it just increases our capabilities across the board. And so he was thinking a lot about using computational tools to extend human capabilities, um, and just had a lot of incredibly brilliant and at the time extremely novel ideas for some of the things that we now consider like the basic foundation of personal computing. It's really came from folks like Doug Engelbart and other pioneers at that time. And he was thinking about human augmentation as a completely sort of different impulse than the impulse of human replacement. So he has, is considered one of the sort of like founders of that school of thought that technology is not about replacing humans, but is about having a human-centric point of view and extending what we're capable of. And so forecasting, it's this fascinating space that connects the dots across the research and the applications. And the research side is just asking the question, what is possible to forecast? How far in advance can we trust a forecast? What are the best methodologies? What sort of data aggregation is the most valuable to do? And how can we use things like AI and machine learning optimization and natural language processing to sort of improve our ability to identify the signal from the noise? And then the application is, of course, it's that empirical ground space where we take the things that we that are working and we apply them. And even in that application, we're continuously learning. And that's really one of the most exciting things to me about forecasting is that it has this beautiful relationship between being a place of accountability where we can actually test our assumptions and test our reasoning and get feedback and debug our reasoning process and understand where we may have made a wrong turn. And at the same time, as it's a tool for accountability, it's also a tool for learning. And just that it to me, it's quite motivating that way that we can bring that toolkit to individuals and organizations who are interested in, in actually learning and getting better and better in that decision-making process.
And where would you say that Metaculus sort of fits in within the space of forecasting, right? You have, people at Pitho who do research-based, contributions to forecasting, trying to find better ways to improve elite forecasters. Whereas Metaculus, it seems more like an entryway into forecasting, taking it sort of away from academia and more into a social space. Is that what you see sort of Metaculus's current contribution to forecasting? Do you see it being somewhere else? I know there's a lot of new initiatives, but just in terms of like the baseline of Metaculus, where would you say it fits in?
I think there are a few things that I think make Metaculus a unique place on the internet. One is that we have a really strong focus on community, and we, have thousands of questions that have been authored by members of the Metaculus forecasting community. And so I think that's something that is pretty unique and special. And it's, writing a good forecasting question can sometimes be an underappreciated part of the process. It takes a bit of skill. And so we have a real community in the sense that there are people who've been doing it for years on the platform, and we have great community moderators. And so you can actually learn how to do that and get better at it. And it's pretty exciting, when you have a kind of burning question about the future and you actually get to see a lot of community engagement with that question. And I know that you guys have just started to write some questions as global guessing on Metaculus, which is really, really awesome to see. And then we have, this space as you're pointing to, Clay, where, we do real world projects and we work with organizations to understand their key themes, their key priorities, and, upcoming decisions. And we do that sort of translation and that coordination process where we look at the tools that we have and we connect the dots to help organizations like the Good Food Institute, like the Virginia Department of Health, to bring forecasting into their decision-making process in a way that's meaningful. And then we also have our sort of research hats on on occasion as well. A lot of our kind of focus internally lately has been more on what I think of as like a product development process, less than an R&D process. But we certainly have teammates who are very much focused on sort of R&D in terms of thinking about how do we, in particular, integrate new technology into our platform to be able to use machine learning and AI to do a sort of differential recalibration and reweighting across, the way that we aggregate forecasts to get a more accurate signal.
So you've talked about, the future of Metaculus and some of the exciting things going on there, and you've also alluded to how when you step back from sort of the science of forecasting, it's a very useful tool for decision making and scenario planning. Are there examples of times that you've used forecasting in your personal life, whether it be outside of sort of Metaculus operations or even for the company, to sort of think about the future? In any way?
It's a great question. And I do just want to say, by the way, the reason that I really want to acknowledge the scientists in the space who have been doing tremendous work, for many years to really bring the science of probabilistic forecasting to where it is today. And I think that in large part, the reason why I sort of have the mental space and we have the time, in our organization to sort of go and say, yes, let's take this out into projects, is that we have so much trust and confidence in in the fact that a lot of the work that's been done in the science and research projects that have come before has just created tools that really work well, and so in large part, that a lot of credit really goes to Phil Tetlock and his and Barbara Mellers and many of their collaborators, and also people like Rob Hindman, who have done a tremendous amount of work on time series forecasting and in other sort of technical spaces. So it's it's really it really feels like we're part of a much larger research community that is now expanding into being a community of both research and practice, and having those two spaces really collaborate and connect the dots. So and in terms of using forecasting in my own life, one of our teammates at Metaculus, Christian, who you'll all probably see on the platform and maybe on Twitter sometimes, shared a story with me recently about sort of having arguments with like friends and family about politics. And one of his new tools that he uses to sort of just stop an argument in its tracks is to say, like, well, what do you think the probability is of that outcome? And so, whoever he's talking with will sort of say, well, I think it's 90% or 95% or because they're sort of arguing for that stance. And he's like, well, I would give it maybe a 15% chance or a 20% chance. And it's like, you just, at that point, there's just we've put a stake in the ground where our beliefs are, and we don't have to kind of go back and forth on the arguments over and over again. We can just sort of wait and see what happens. So I think that was a really a tool that I learned from, and I ended up actually using that technique in a couple of conversations after that. And then in terms of, forecasting in, bigger sort of life decisions, I think we all do that intuitively. And there isn't necessarily the need to like write down an explicit model and write down what our priors are and then update them as we go along for every single life decision. But for the big ones, I actually do, I do that a bit more in the last couple of years than in the past.
And do you guys use forecasting internally at Metaculus to forecast potential, forecast future of the business, potential deals, any of that? Are you guys forecasting internally at Metaculus, and how so?
It's a great question, Clay. We don't do enough of it. We've started. It's an interesting sort of quirk of Metaculus culture that that we're so focused on very quantitatively evaluating the quality of reasoning through all of the tools that we build, and those tools are not always internally focused. So we've started to do a little bit more of that. I think that if I'm looking at myself as a forecaster, I think I do. I have certain areas I think I do pretty well in, but if you ask me to forecast on a topic where I have a particularly personal interest, and especially if there's something that I believe I can do to move the needle to change the outcome, I'm not really going to be an unbiased forecaster as much as I would like. And maybe that's an area to improve, but I am self-aware about that. So I think there's a set of tools around just measuring key performance indicators inside of the company and looking at where are the metrics that we care about now and where do we want them to be in 30, 60, 90 days or a year from now. That's actually a little bit more about sort of the psychology of motivation, as well as just making sure that you're being systematic in your prioritization, and you're really looking at the things that deserve the most time, as well as sort of your best working hours. For some people it's first thing in the morning, and for some people they really get the most done late at night, and that's kind of an individual thing. And so it's sort of a tool for aligning your priorities with making sure that that the right numbers are ticking up. But that's obviously quite different than actually forecasting. And I think that, they can be related though. So as you get more sophisticated in your measurement of key performance indicators within a company, then you start to see patterns, and you can actually use forecasting um, as I would see that as kind of like an additional sort of playful layer, because I do think that in our company culture it's really important to um, we don't want to demotivate someone by like forecasting that a project is not going to work out, when it may be that we're actually trying to encourage experimentation in something we've never done before. And we're, accepting that like a big part of that, the value from a project like that might be learning what's possible.
Yeah, actually, I was just thinking, given just the nature of startups and what any base rate of success is, it's probably difficult to forecast really important things without just even if you understand like the base rates, and that if let's say there's a 10% success of startups and now you're forecasting 17, that's actually great, but 17 is not for people going to be an intuitively positive number. No one's going to say, hey, we're 70% above the base rate, or that probably wouldn't be their own first thought. So I could see how that could make bringing forecasting in a little bit more challenging, especially just given the nature of early stage companies.
One of the funny things about forecasting about Metaculus though is that there are quite a few questions about the future of Metaculus that are just public, that are about Metaculus that are on the platform. So one that came up recently was
the Alexa index.
There was the Alexa index. There was another one about what's the likelihood that Metaculus will put out a mobile application and for iOS and Android. And I wrote to somebody said, well, has this been has this been seriously discussed publicly? And I just answered honestly, and I said, well, we're working on a mobile first design. We're going to share it very soon, and for comments, and we're really excited to see how people respond to this design. And like, we know that Metaculus is not super easy to use on mobile devices, and we really want to address that challenge. And so because we've like just invested a bunch of time in thinking about a mobile first design that's responsive, we probably are not going to prioritize an application for a while. And they were just like, thanks, that's great, that totally influences my forecast. So it's I really like the transparency, that sort of open access question about what we're working on can be part of what the community is forecasting on. And it's not exactly the same as like a poll, right? It's not like, hey, do you want us to build a mobile app? It's certainly not what the question was. But we can sort of glean from how popular is the question, and there are lots of people, is there a lot of activity? Like we might take that as a kind of an input.
So the more forecasts that are on that question might indicate that it's more likely. So that could be a signal to keep a lookout on that question. There you go. The more forecasts actually should tick up a little bit.
So I want to go back to the KPIs briefly, because I think that's really interesting. We talked offline about how Metaculus is partnering with the Virginia Department of Health to launch this forecasting tournament, the Keep Virginia Safe tournament. How do KPIs that you're looking at differ from, a tournament like that to sort of just thinking about Metaculus as a platform more generally? Are there different things that you're looking at, or are some of them the same across both? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that the two sets of kind of goals there are really related, but they are a little bit distinct. So for a project like the Keep Virginia Safe tournament, we are really looking at how can we provide information in a way that is timely and accurate, that is as absolutely relevant and valuable as possible to our partners at VDH. And that requires a lot of listening to what they need, and kind of translating that into the sort of specific, detailed, forecastable, operationalized Metaculus question that we can then bring to the platform and use as that information gathering tool. And it also part of our job there is to also communicate to our forecasting community, what are we doing, why, what's the impact going to be, which sort of brings people in and engages forecasters more when they are fully in the loop on the direct impact that their forecasts might have in decision making. And so that is that's really our focus. And so we look at kind of like the speed at which we can generate an aggregate forecast. We obviously empirically measure its accuracy always, and then we look at that sort of translation process from a specific probability distribution or number, and how does that actually translate across into a larger set of considerations that's going into a decision that has to be made by a certain date. So that's kind of what we're looking at for those types of partnerships. And then for the Metaculus platform overall, I mean, there's a much larger set of considerations there. It's one that's very connected to a project like BDH is basically, how do we create an ecosystem in which a project like the Keep Virginia Safe tournament can actually work very well. And so what does that environment look like? Well, it means that we have to have an engaged community. It means that we have to have tools that people like using. It means that that there's enough kind of interest in content that people are coming back regularly. It means that we're also conveying that the type of work that we're doing kind of aligns with the values of the people who are showing up. I mean, that's kind of a self-selecting process, right? We say this is what we're doing, and the people who are excited about those things like come. And we have a lot of diversity of themes on Metaculus, and so it's not that every forecaster has to be excited about every theme. Absolutely not. So like one of the things that we're thinking about is, how do we do a little bit of a better job sort of matching forecasting interest to forecasting question. It's a really big question, because we don't want to fall into the trap of information silos. And if you just sort of one time say like, yeah, I'm interested in space exploration, and then you go on Metaculus and that's like all you see, that would be a shame, because you would lose out on just this really interesting diversity of questions where there's just so much creativity in our community. And I learn every day from the forecasting community of things that are going on in the world. And so I think there are also people who come to Metaculus to get almost as a news source to just find out about interesting things that are going on in the world. And so if we sort of too tightly couple that that interest score, and we assume that we know what someone wants to see beforehand, then there could be significant downside there. And then there are the other sort of platform goals that we have around continuously increasing our accuracy on the Metaculus prediction, and investing also in a culture where everyone on our team feels like they are contributing in a really meaningful way, and like they are I think the ideal, like I don't know if you've heard of the Japanese work term Ikigai. Ikigai is idea where if you are so it's what you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can get paid for. And it's basically a Venn diagram where those four things overlap.
Great concept.
It's a totally great concept. And it's interesting because in the social sciences, there have been some studies that have shown that like people who rate themselves as having high Ikigai like are very happy, which makes sense, and even like have are even like healthier. So that's the kind of thing where we'd love to create that culture where everyone has the ability to on our team to feel that they're checking those boxes. And so part of what that means is that we as a company have to be also checking those boxes, like that we're we are doing things that we're good at and that the world needs, and that are valuable, that we can get paid for.
And just quick question on that. Is the Metaculus team, I'm guessing because of the pandemic, it's now remote, but was the company designed that way? Is it run that way?
Yeah.
Or do you have an office?
Yeah, it's a great question. So so the company was definitely run that way when I started advising, and then I didn't live in the same, like, people in the company almost everybody started in Santa Cruz, California. That is where, two of the founders were professors. Now one is still a professor there, and the other of those two professors teaches at Yale. That's Greg Laughlin. And then the third founder was a PhD student at UC Santa Cruz. So Anthony still teaches there. Max went to school there. Greg used to teach there. And then David, the fourth Metaculus co-founder, was not connected to the university, but was very connected to the place and lived in Santa Cruz. Since that time, basically only one person of those four still lives in Santa Cruz. But it's still a place that, there's a strong connection to, and friendships here, and like the university connection. And I actually grew up in Santa Cruz. And then, so even like when I first started coming to Santa Cruz to have meetings with Anthony and some of the other team members, they would sort of say, "Oh yeah, let's meet at such and such, coffee shop. It's on this street." And I'm like, "I know." And they're like, "I forgot, I forgot that you also, have a connection to this place." So, but we've once you are committed to a remote strategy, it really changes how you hire. It really changes how you manage just your workflow, the tools that you invest in, and the way that you run meetings. And it's so we were ready for the pandemic in that sense. It did not really disrupt any of our processes. And then as we've kind of now started to move into mostly kind of a post-vaccination phase in our team, and we could be getting together in person, we actually just did a team gathering earlier this week, which was super awesome to just see people, and very unusual. We're like, what? Wait, do we shake hands? What do we do? But it was there's we're now a very global team, and I think we're going to stay that way.
Great. I was wondering if you could give us and our listeners a sort of a breakdown of what forecasting causes are at Metaculus and how that compares to the forecasting tournaments. I know that as of right now, there are two different forecasting causes, one on feeding humanity, and the other is on healthy communities. And I was just wondering, could you explain those and how they differ from what's being done with the Virginia Department of Health?
Absolutely. Yeah, so this is a little bit of a potentially too subtle of a distinction. We were wondering how easy this would be to understand, and it's we're kind of still in a learning phase here. So the thought with causes. So let me back up and just say, forecasting causes is a toolkit that we wanted to create in order to facilitate forecasting on causes, altruistic causes, in a way that would allow us to more closely partner with charities and foundations and nonprofits, as well as just institutions that are working on sort of altruistic causes in the world. And because, for example, we have done I think 4 tournaments now, all related to COVID-19, and we've worked with different groups. We thought, well, maybe we could, if from a discovery standpoint, as a Metaculus user, maybe you'd like to be able to discover all of the content, all of the tournaments that we've done around COVID, in one sort of place. And how would we, how should we think about that? And so we wanted to create an umbrella sort of cause framework so that we could have multiple tournaments and multiple partnerships, but still have sort of that home for any given cause on the platform. and, or potentially like multiple tournaments with even, with the same partner. And and forecasting causes has another dimension, which is that we allow anybody to basically increase the prize pool of a tournament in that cause area by becoming a forecasting cause supporter. And so, Metaculus has some Patreon supporters who are so just grateful to have on board. And they're generally supporting the overall Metaculus project. And so this is kind of a little bit more of a granular way. If there's a particular cause that you want to support for good forecasts being developed in that area, you can direct support that way. And support for a cause will be split between the prize pool and the tournament operations and administration for that, for any tournaments that are running in that cause area. So that's kind of the background on causes themselves. And then tournaments, we imagine, if a tournament is related to a particular cause, we'll sort of live under that umbrella. And we hope to be, a convening ground where we can even introduce, organizations that might be working on the same cause to each other, and to maybe facilitate groups of questions that might be inputs into, into decision making across, multiple groups. And so that's one of the exciting things that we can do in causes as well, sort of be this hub of like coordinating information sharing, and and bringing in communities that are already connected to different cause areas or to different organizations that can be brought in to sort of interact with that particular theme on the Metaculus platform. And then tournaments themselves are a little bit more of a general concept where there could be tournaments that are not necessarily related to a cause, that might just be related to an interesting topic in science or to economic forecasting work. So they don't necessarily have to be cause-based, but the two that we've launched in the last few weeks are both cause-related.
And so going off of that, for instance, in the Feeding Humanities cause, there's an alt protein tournament where you're looking at different, like at the future of how we feed ourselves, what we put into our bodies. And if, people who are listening go to the page, you'll see that there's a breakdown of the 3 types of questions that'll be asked during the tournament. 2 of them, I think people will be probably familiar with, the calibration questions and the long-term questions. But one of the interesting ones in this tournament is the fortified essays. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about the fortified essays and their importance to forecasting into these tournaments.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. We are eagerly all sort of, we actually were talking about this in our product meeting this morning. We're putting some final touches. I guess I shouldn't say final. We're adding more touches to this feature, and it will be ready pretty soon. It needs a little bit more work, but we're really, really excited about fortified essays because they are a very direct way to connect the verbal and the mathematical, or analysis that is qualitative and forecasts that are quantitative. And a lot of what we've been finding is that in the more you move into the application space and out of the research space, that qualitative component is really important to help people understand both how any given forecast was arrived at, and also what its potential implications might be, and how to sort of embed it within a larger decision-making process. And so, if you are working with, say, neural networks, this is a very, very common problem in AI, where you might get some numbers and sometimes they're really accurate, maybe sometimes they're not. And it's really hard to tell the difference because you cannot debug in many cases. I mean, this is now a very active research theme of interpretable AI. That helps you to understand, like, how was any given answer arrived at. And so we are, we're doing the exact same thing with fortified essays. We're helping, forecasters and, the sort of endpoints of organizations that may be using forecasts to understand better how a given forecast was arrived at. And, but prompts for fortified essays can be quite varied. The fortified essay, as an idea, really what it is it's just an essay that has testable predictions embedded within it. And so you could use that format to answer lots of different questions. You could answer the question, given that you're forecasting on the future of alt protein, for example, what do you think are going to be, the most impactful, technologies to invest in the next 10 years? And you could say, tell me your analysis of like why you believe that. Show me some testable predictions that help to back up your claims. By the same token, you could ask, here is a risk area, for example, here is a public health, sort of risk that we're forecasting on. And instead of saying, what should we invest in, you might say, like, what do you believe are going to be the most important interventions and why? And so it actually helps to connect the dots in that way. And so we've been talking with partners about, this new capability, including in education. Actually, we're quite excited. We're doing a small pilot project now where we're actually seeing Metaculus used in the classroom. And so we've started to talk with professors, and they're like, absolutely, I will assign these as homework, So the fortified essay has use in the classroom, and then it also has use, in the public policy space. And, for us, it's a core. We'd like to build tools that are super scalable and that like add value to a lot of different use cases. And so that's really how we're seeing this will be used quite differently in different contexts. But fundamentally, the thing that it does is it helps to connect writing and ideas with the testable, quantitative probabilistic predictions on the Metaculus platform. And that, that also goes to just, public analysis in the public domain. I don't know if you all have read our COVID analyst, Juan Cambero's a couple of recent blog posts on COVID variants. Some of the comments that we get from when people read them are like, I wish that, the news covered the subject, like this. Where there is that, background explanation, and there's, here's a worldview, or here's a model of the world that you're sort of sharing evidence for. And if it's true, here's what we'll see, and here are these predictions. Or just, reporting, here's what, the Metaculus community thinks is likely in any given space, whether it's the future of renewable energy, or the future of space exploration, or the future of longevity science, or any of these, fascinating areas, or even just, U.S. economic indicators, which we've been doing more forecasting on in the last 6 months as well.
And what kind of tools are you building for the fortified essay when it comes to the person writing it? Is that it's easy to sort of like embed like a Metaculus forecast into what you're writing? Okay.
That's exactly it. Yeah, it's as simple as that. That's really it. It's just a tool where you can write an essay, and as you're writing, you can natively embed Metaculus forecasts, and you'll have a little bit of you'll have some flexibility in terms of which graphs you show, and being able to show the community prediction or being able to show your prediction, and there'll be some other future capabilities there, but I best not tease them too soon.
And would you have to create a question? Like, would a question already have to exist, or like, can you create your own questions while you're writing a fortified essay?
That is such a great question, Clay. You're totally ahead of us. That is something that we just have been talking about, because Yeah, one of the things that we're starting to think about, I kind of just talked about, how would we love to read the news, or kind of public access, news stories. What if a news story was sort of merged with a scientific paper? If you like put those two together, we would love that to be a fortified essay. So it's like it's understandable, it's as accessible as reading the news, but it's as quantitative and testable as like a scientific paper, or maybe even more than some than some papers. um, and so yeah, one of the things that we've been thinking about is, there may be, in the creative process of just writing a piece, like an essay or an article, that there may be predictions that you come up with that you want to embed within the story that may not already exist on the platform. And so we're thinking through the possibilities there. Yeah, it would be great to enable that.
Great. And then sort of moving from forecasting causes, I have a sort of a question about just like larger Metaculus use. Um, and I'm wondering sort of how you guys are thinking about it over at Metaculus. I think there have been a lot of commentaries out there about the Metaculus scoring system, which I don't want to really get into here. It's sort of more like a meta level perspective of Metaculus scoring. It's the scoring system based on the leaderboard seems to be just like an aggregate total score. So it's in some way based on forecasting accuracy, but it's also just based on the amount of time spent on Metaculus. And I'm wondering, are there considerations about how to change scoring to not just reflect sort of time spent on the platform? Because I can imagine, like, as of right now, it's still relatively new, small enough user base that if you started now, you could reasonably climb to the top of the leaderboards. But if you were to start forecasting, say, in 2023, the leaderboards have been up then for years. Some people might have thousands, tens of thousands of score. As a new forecaster, it'd almost be impossible unless like those people stop forecasting or they get really bad at forecasting to sort of make your way up to the top would be difficult. So are you guys thinking about how you can give incentives that are not tied to sort of total forecasting time?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I'll say here. One is that it's a very delicate balance, and we've tried very hard to kind of strike the right balance, because we don't want to punish latecomers to forecasting, and we don't want to make it too easy to like earn a reward without any effort. So you will get rewarded more if you predict on questions early, if you predict on more questions. But the sort of the downside for being late is linear with respect to how late you are, whereas the reward for being early the reward, not the reward for being early, the reward for being accurate is exponential. So there's a linear versus an exponential relationship there. And that this is the way that we've designed this, is we've thought very carefully about tournament structure and what feels fair there. And so at the end of the day, if you join a tournament at sort of the tail end, you shouldn't really be able to expect to like come in at the last minute and get a big prize. But if you're very accurate, you should still like do really well. And so that's kind of how the recent big update that we made to the way that our scoring works is very specifically like geared toward that tournament structure. And then in terms of just rewarding participation, rewarding accuracy, there's a couple things that we're thinking about here. One is just like in sort of like baseball statistics, or in any sort of project where you're looking at different dimensions of skill, we recognize that there are lots of different kinds of skills in forecasting, and they're going to even be different if you look at like different topics, if you look at different time frames. Having a purely apples to apples comparison, that's the only way that you can truly compare the true skill of any one forecaster versus another. And it's incredibly difficult to have a complete apples to apples comparison. So we are building a new set of tools later in the year, where we'll be looking at sort of expanding the number of statistics that we report, enabling those apples to apples comparisons where they make sense. And I think just being more transparent about the fact that like apples to apples is actually is one way of is one very rigorous way of comparing this forecasting skill, and where you can get it. And so that, and sort of just making it clear that we're not doing that in all cases. And then there's sort of a whole other set of rewards and recognition and acknowledgement that can exist on the platform that don't have to do with just making forecasts. There are things that we really appreciate. Question authors, we really appreciate great comments. And the discussion is such a rich place where people come and learn and engage. And so we're also kind of thinking about ways that we can more explicitly acknowledge and recognize those other kinds of contributions. We were talking about this earlier. Great forecasting is a particular set of skills that can go into that. And those are not necessarily the same skills as what's needed to write great questions. And so sometimes it's not even the same people, who have a sort of a, comparative advantage in those different areas. And so we want to kind of broaden the scope of what we're trying to do to not just, we are absolutely, building core tools for the most accurate forecasting that we can. And at the same time, forecasting is one part of the process, because the ultimate goal that we have as a company and as a platform is really to improve that decision-making process that we talked about, and to help, and to expand knowledge and like increase, learning, and to develop also that, intrinsic motivation around learning. And so that the overall project of creating shared knowledge, you can contribute to that in a lot of different ways. And so we want to make sure that we're being, that we're recognizing that.
On the topic of sort of that and sort of the purpose, I think that sort of ties in well to Good Judgment Open. And for those of you who are unaware, Good Judgment Open is a forecasting platform created by the Good Judgment Project, which was a spin-off of Good Judgment Inc., which is what the book Super Forecasting is based on. Two-part question. One is sort of, what do you see as the key differences outside of users submitting their own questions, which is obviously a very large difference between the two platforms. But outside of that, what are the differences that you see as the key differentiators between the two? And then also, is there what sort of work is being done, do you think, to establish a common way of talking about forecasts between the Metaculus and the Good Judgment community? You were talking about sort of, as you build Metaculus, to have it be successful, you need people engaging on the platform, which means that over time, if Metaculus is successful, you'll have some people who primarily forecast on Metaculus and some who primarily forecast on Good Judgment. There'll be crossovers, but if you're achieving your engagement rates, they'll probably have a preferred home. And so to facilitate sort of larger forecasting dialogue, I think there needs to be a sort of a common set of terminology. This is something that our colleague, Mikhail Dabrowski, has been working on when it comes to creating sort of common words associated with probabilities. So just to tie it back to those two questions, what do you see as your key differentiator from Good Judgment Open? And then what sort of work is being done to facilitate a common set of terms and creating dialogue between the two different forecasting communities?
Great questions. I think just empirically, what we focused on as two different forecasting platforms is a bit different. I think of Good Judgment as tending a little bit more toward geopolitics, although they have been doing a lot of COVID stuff too in the last year. Whereas, Metaculus we tend to lean a little bit further toward the science and technology topics. We did a little bit of an analysis on this recently, where we actually looked at our overall questions on the site, since the beginning, and by far and away the largest number of questions that we have are on science and technology.
AI in particular, I'm guessing.
AI is a big one, certainly, but it's actually a bit broader than that. It spans across advances in across different fields, the biosciences, space exploration, just computer science in general, security. So there's that, and I think that attracts a little bit of a different kind of community. We do have a fairly large number of folks, who are members of the Metaculus forecasting community, who have a background in computer science, or data science, or somewhere in STEM. So I think that's one differentiator. That just comes from the types of questions that we ask, and just how we focused the content of the site. And then I think another thing that is also kind of just related to technology is that Metaculus as an organization has a greater focus on technology. We build our own tools. And so we have that integration between what sorts of capabilities we want to enable, and then being able to sort of quickly deploy changes, or I should say at a reasonable pace, deploy changes as we develop as we develop new ideas based on the feedback that we're getting, and sort of the opportunities that we see in the community. And then in terms of connecting the dots, I think I'm hoping that I'll have more to say about that fairly soon. I see the forecasting space as being populated by just a lot of really interesting people, and really, really smart scientists and practitioners. And I'd love to just see more collaboration, and including things like what you've mentioned about creating some standardization in terminology, and maybe even some of the forecast evaluation processes. So I'm pretty excited about the potential for that kind of collaboration now, more than ever. There's actually an academic working group that is being run right now well, of course, all on Zoom, but at the University of Pennsylvania. And there are a number of folks, around the country, and even some overseas, who are part of this working group. And I think it's just created a really a very strong, direct connection for that kind of conversation to happen. So it's pretty exciting, and that's really only started a few months ago, and a few weeks ago rather, and it will go through the rest of the year.
So before we get to our final segment, which is the rapid fire questions, which you might have seen on some of our past interviews, just curious about where you see forecasting going in the future. So something that might be tied to this common lexicon that might be developed in the next few years. But you also mentioned that you're seeing adoption in schools with fortified essays. Where do you think forecasting, which is, Clay and I have identified as still somewhat of a hobby space, still somewhat niche and under the radar, where do you see it going, its potential in the future in terms of adoption and just greater usage socially?
It's also a great question. If you'd asked me this question a year ago, I probably would have said, well, I think that we should really be bringing forecasting into companies, large and small. And now, a year later, having spent a lot of the last year looking at various sorts of, pockets of uncertainty that are, to a greater or lesser degree, related to this global pandemic, which has just created uncertainty and, sort of an unprecedented level in our lifetimes. I would actually say that there's a tremendous amount of, potential for adoption in sort of a public health space, in, government decision making more broadly, in the way that philanthropy and research organizations think about resource allocation. And then, of course, there's, the investor mindset, whether you are an investor on Wall Street, or whether you're an investor in a philanthropic organization where you're thinking long term about what capabilities exist today, what capabilities might exist, 10 or 20 years from today, and what do we need to be doing now? Where do we need to be investing to get there? There's a, there's a stance of sort of defense against risk, and there's also a stance of sort of, moving toward opportunity. And I think that, that second stance of moving toward opportunity is a really, really powerful one for forecasting. I have to say that, they're both very important. Looking at risks, protecting against downside risk is also a really valuable place to use forecasting. But I think that they're stronger together. If you're only ever sort of responding to risk, then you can fall into a pattern of or habit of mind where you're just really reactive and you're responding to what is happening in the near term in the space around you. And I think that it requires a bit of that longer term view to get the most value out of forecasting as a tool.
Great. And so now we are moving on to our rapid fire round, although this is going to be a special rapid fire round. This week, we are going to give you a chance to warm up your forecasting chops by going through 5 different questions on Metaculus and just give an over-under on what the community median is. And then we're going to hop into our standard 4 rapid fire forecasts that all guests on this podcast have to give. So we are going to start off with a question that we have forecasted on Metaculus Mondays. What is likelihood that a majority of the Quad and the Five Eyes countries boycott the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing? So this would be Canada, US, UK, Japan, Australia, India, and New Zealand. The community median is 15%. Gaia, are you above or below that?
I would say I'm a little below that. I think that's really, really unlikely, actually, because, okay, so thinking aloud, I think that the general desire in the sort of Five Eyes, countries, in particular, led by, the U.S. and in looking at U.S.-China relations, would be, that having a good relationship with China is much more valuable in the long term and is a better way to, kind of secure the safety and the prosperity of U.S. national interests. That being said, there's a, significant risk of, increasing aggression between, by mainland China in Taiwan. And so I think that's where that 15% comes from is, you're basically saying if there's a really, really significant action that's taken that, at a geopolitical level, at a diplomatic level a stance needs to be taken sort of against, unjustified violence. Then I think that's where that boycott would come from. And I think, there's different ways that you could see it going. There could be an argument made for, the Olympics being a place where we should create cultural connections, and, the Olympics are not the place for sort of geopolitical debate. But yeah, I guess I would go with maybe 10%.
10%. And that is actually one of the rapid fire questions too. So We will log that
Okay.
as a 10% for that. Question number 2. Will there be renewed fighting between Russia and Ukraine in the Donbass this summer? This question would resolve positively if more than 215 Ukrainian military members were to die in any given month. We have also forecasted this one on Metaculus Mondays, and we gave it a 25%. I mean, the community median is 25%. We're at 15% likelihood on this question. And the associated rapid fire question for this one is, what is the likelihood that Russia annexes territory in Eastern Europe by 2026? So an over-under and a forecast on the annexation.
I'm not sure you're going to like my answer. I feel like I haven't done quite enough reading lately. Like the situation in Russia is so volatile right now. And I don't think that it would be the responsible thing for me to do to sort of put a number out there, because I would, for this type of question, the stakes are high. And I don't want to add to the noise if I can instead be a little bit more educated and add to the signal.
What about the over-under, though, on the community forecast? We'll let you skip the rapid fire, but you're not going to get unscathed from both.
So the
More than
community meeting is
25%, and we were at 15%.
I guess I'm under on this one too.
Okay.
I think 20 is a little high.
This next question, which was recommended by Twitter. Will a member of the Trump family be the Republican nominee for the U.S. presidency in 2024? 33% likelihood. Over under on that?
That one, I'm I think I have to go over.
Over on that. It's probably where we would be too. Number 4 is the likelihood that AOC becomes the Democratic nominee for president by 2032. So all the way through the 2032 cycle. 9% community median on that one.
I'm over.
Yeah.
What was it? Nominee or elected?
Just the Democratic presidential nominee. Yeah, that one does seem very low for the community
quite low
median.
To me.
Yeah. And then another one, which is we also did a Metaculus Monday on, is what is the likelihood that Israel and Saudi Arabia establish official diplomatic relations in 2021? We actually were way below the community median, and they have now gotten below us since the fighting in between Israel and Hamas has kicked off. 10% community median on official diplomatic relations by the end of this year.
I think I'm under.
And then what about by 2025? That is a rapid fire question. We need a percentage on by 2025.
The same question for 2025. I guess I'll go 20.
20%. Then we have one more rapid fire question. Andrew, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, so for the last question of the episode, it's a bit more lighthearted, not very close to any of the places we've discussed so far. This question actually has to do with space. So the question is, by 2030, what do you think the likelihood is that we find life or, signs of life in outer space? It can be sort of like a single cell organism or through any manifestation of life that you have in your mind.
And convincing techno-signatures as well. So, in theory, if the report that the U.S. is due by the end of this year on UFOs, I say no one should call them UAPs. That is nonsense. But UFOs, that would also do if they had, high confidence that they were from other intelligent life.
I'm going to have to go quite high on this one because, we were just talking about this at lunch at our offsite, and some evidence was being shared. There's a recent book that just got published. There's some new photos of Mars that seem very very relevant to this question. So especially by 2030, I guess I'm gonna go for like a 65.
And that's primarily based on the idea of finding like single cell organism life on Mars or evidence of past life on Mars. Is that where the majority of your forecast is coming? Is there any weight given to, 60 Minutes this last week had a whole segment on UFOs? I'm curious where that's fitting in. We had a previous guest, Sar, the founder of Root Claim, and I think a large part of his forecast, or a solid chunk of that, was coming from things of that nature. So
yeah, it's an area that I think most people have, or I think many people have not sort of given any credence to the shoddy evidence of UFO sightings. And there's a recent book that has come out that apparently, I have not read it, but it apparently is a careful review of a lot more recent evidence, and like it's apparently like much more verified than in previous. I mean, when the just the number of cameras that we have out there, and the ability, like the ease with which we can capture stuff very quickly is just increasing, and so there's more people looking. There's more just more sensors out there in the world that could be looking for these sorts of techno signatures or sightings or other kinds of evidence. So I have to say, like, I this is also an area where I'd like to get more educated before sort of making a really a strong, confident statement about what I believe. But I think I've been shifted off of, zero belief to this is like definitely impossible, to basically saying, well, maybe I need to update my prior there. And there's, with all of the Fermi paradox conversations, over the last many years, like if we're going to take it seriously that we're, that life, intelligent life could be, or even, very basic life could be, could be out there somewhere. I don't know. It's starting to feel like maybe by 2030 we'll have sensors that are capable of picking something up.
Awesome. Well, Gaia, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. Is there anything you would like to tell our listeners? Where can they find you? What can they be expecting from Metaculus in the near future? Yep, all that great stuff.
Yeah, you can find us at metaculus.com. You can find us on Twitter and say hello. We'd like to hear from you. And something you can expect to hear about pretty soon here is, and that's me on Twitter, is you can look out for some updates on our 2 cause-related tournaments in the near future. And you can also look for a kind of a prototype new design language that, as I mentioned before, is really going to be mobile first. And we're really excited to hear feedback. I think it's going to be one of the biggest changes to the Metaculus, platform, since its inception. So it's something that we're very, very eager to get, community feedback on before making, the sort of big change. So we're going to be showing some prototype designs pretty soon, and then we'll actually have a sort of just a prototype site where people can play with it before we just turn the switch overnight and have the chance to give us their thoughts. So we're eagerly awaiting feedback on that with bells on.
Well, that is very exciting, and we look forward to seeing the design and giving our own feedback on it. Yeah.
Exactly.
All right, everyone. This was the 14th episode of the Global Guessing Weekly Podcast with the CEO of Metaculus, Gaia Dempsey. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And that's a record.